Ave Maria, and welcome to Divine Poetry, a series that explores the chronological parallels between the history of the Catholic Church and the Old Testament. If you're new to this concept, go back and watch my interview with Kevin Davis. The link is in the video description below. To make things more simple, I have divided up church history and the Old Testament into 8 color-coded time periods. Below you can see a scrolling bar with the names, dates, and the Old Testament books for each period. Use this timeline to guide you in each video. The color frame of each video will match the time period that we're discussing. Now, let's start today's episode. Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of Divine Poetry. Today's episode, I want to go through another prophecy in the book of Daniel. It's Daniel chapter 8. It's the vision of the one-horned goat and the two-horned lamb, and how it relates again to Antiochus, and Antiochus as a prefigurement of the Antichrist. If you remember, we presented that last video. So these prophecies are all going to be included in my upcoming book, Vatican II and Antichrist, which I hope to have ready for release by July 16th, the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. To all of the editors out there who are helping me to look through the book, I really appreciate it. You know who you are. When it comes back from editing, I'll be able to order the book. And like I said, hopefully we'll be able to ship by July 16th. It might be a little bit later than that, but not too much later than that. In order to anticipate demand for the book, which I'm not quite sure how to do, it could be a lot of people or very little people, because of the nature of the book is sensitive, I guess, or is unique. Because of that, I don't know how many books to order. So I would really appreciate it if you could go on to our websites and sign up for the book, just to drop your name and an email address or whatever, so I know what the demand will be. I mean, just some rough ballpark idea is what I'm looking for. Or if you want to pre-order the book, that would be really great, because then I would have some capital to order the books in the first place. That would be fantastic. Also, we launched our new publishing company website, gloriousHeritageBooks.com. So that's going to be our new hub of activity right there. That's going to supersede MaccabeanUprising.com and GloriousHeritageCartoons.com. So that'll just be the one-stop shop for everything. Very excited about that. Okay, so the book also comes with 2 color brochures. They're 2-sided color brochures. They're 9 inch by 16 inches. And these 3 are going to demonstrate 3 of the concepts from Vatican II and Antichrist book. There's the prophecy of the 70 weeks of years, which we have discussed in prior episodes of this podcast, but also the book of the Apocalypse, specifically the 7-headed beast out of the sea, the 2-horned lamb, and the 2 witnesses. All of those 3 concepts out of the book of the Apocalypse, they all have structural similarities to the book of Daniel, prophecy of 70 weeks text, or that narrative. So I will eventually get into those concepts in this podcast, not today, but those brochures are going to be included. And the third brochure is an updated version of the Passion of the Church and the Passion of Christ, the gospel accounts of our Lord's Passion, and then Vatican II and all the things that happened from 1958 up until probably the early or the mid-70s. They all have a chronological parallel with the Passion of Christ. For those of you who got my book Stumbling Block, you received one of those brochures. This is an updated one that has some new concepts in it, and I removed some of the ones that I don't think were very strong parallels. I took them off the brochure and I made room for some new ones. Okay, here is the table of contents. Oh wait, I'm going to also do a quick shout out to Novus Ordo Watch. I just really want to say thank you very much for sharing my book on your Twitter feed and on Facebook. I was a little overwhelmed with the support and the interest in it. Wow, I didn't expect that, and I'm, I guess, humbled and very appreciative. So thank you very much for doing that. All right, now next item on the list. I'm trying to clear off all my items before we start here. So this is the table of contents for the book Vatican II and Antichrist, and I just want to go over it a little bit so you can see. There's a preface and introduction, and that's where I really kind of set the stage and the tone of the book in those pages. There's 2 concepts that permeate throughout the book that most of the book is founded upon, or that it's built upon. And the first concept is that the Catholic Church is the mystical body of Christ, and that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. This is the things that our catechism teaches us, that the whole Eucharist is our Lord's body, blood, soul, and divinity. It's actually, literally, of course, as we believe, our Lord. The Mass is his sacrifice on our altars. So the point, though, is that the church manifests Christ to us. So an anti-church, an anti-Mass, an anti-Pope, an anti-priest, all the things that Vatican II has given us is Antichrist. And so that theme comes up quite a bit throughout the book. And also the second theme, which is something I want to talk about here a little bit in this podcast, excuse me, in which we already have talked about in many other episodes prior, is that the abomination of desolation for us in our time is the Novus Ordo rite more than anything else. And so from that concept, the rest of the book also flows. Let's make sure I'm not missing anything here. Yeah, okay. So anyway, here the table of contents then is going to go on to chapter 1 is going to be the book of Daniel. Chapter 2, I take a break from prophecy and I go into the biblical titles of Antichrist, the ones that have been given to us in the Old Testament that the church fathers and the footnotes tell us is a name for Antichrist. For instance, the foolish shepherd from the book of Zacharias, and there's many more. The man of sin from 2 Thessalonians and such. Third chapter, book of the Apocalypse. Fourth chapter is the Vatican and the Temple, and this draws upon the idea of parallels quite heavily. Chapter 5, the crucifixion of the church, which is what that brochure is going to display. Chapter 6 is 2 brothers and 7 kings, and this is something that I have not presented yet. I might do it in a future episode. It basically shows that Rome was founded first on 2 brothers and then 7 kings, and then the undoing of Rome, which is what looks like it's happening right now, is happening in reverse order, and I'll have to get into that in a different episode. And then chapter 7 is a lot of miscellaneous topics, and I have some appendices as well. So inside of those topics are quite a lot of interesting parallels and prophecy fulfillments. Of course, I can't get into them all in this podcast, but that's what the book's for. But I'm going to try to get a lot of them out, at least get the concepts out, so you can understand what's going to be in the book, have a better idea of what you might be reading. Okay, moving on. All right, so let's get into today's material, because I have quite a lot today, and I might have to cut it short. I'm already at 6 minutes. But the idea that the Novus Ordo is the abomination of desolation is like a keystone. When the Romans built aqueducts or arches, this keystone, which would be placed at the very top of the arch, is what held the whole thing in place. If you take that keystone out, everything collapses. But the trick about putting the keystone in place is that you have to have a framework first to build the arch around. And once the arch is in place, the keystone is set in a position that its downward pressure keeps the arch from collapsing, and then you could take the framework out of the way and build the rest of the structure. Well, that's similar to what this book is like, and the concepts that I bring out. The keystone concept here is that the Novus Ordo is the abomination. Without that keystone concept, everything else kind of falls down. But amazingly, though, we can't come to that conclusion of the Novus Ordo being the abomination with any degree of certainty without these parallels. And my whole book, Divine Poetry, is meant to show the parallels between church history and the Old Testament, culminating with the books of the Maccabees and Vatican II, specifically the Novus Ordo rite and the abomination of desolation, which is mentioned in the books of the Maccabees. It's a false sacrifice mandated on a second altar when the true sacrifice was outlawed, and there's a whole bunch of circumstances around it. All of it is Vatican II in parallel, because we have the second, quote, altars, we have a profane, quote, sacrifice, it's invalid, and on and on. So if you've been following these episodes, you're clearly familiar with that concept. So that framework of parallels lets us have this keystone in place. So when you have that keystone there, you take the framework out and you can build the rest. Now, in one of the prior episodes, I went into the book of Daniel and showed that with the understanding of what the abomination is for us, the prophecy of the 70 weeks of years unfolds, and you can see the fulfillment of it. And that's only possible if we know what the abomination is in our time, because then you can go through and find dates and do the prophecy backwards. I refer you back to a prior episode for that. Okay, so today I want to talk about another prophecy in the book of Daniel. It's Daniel chapter 8, and this is the prophecy of the ram, or the vision of the ram and the sheep. Now, the idea of this is that when you go through the footnotes again of Daniel, it tells you who these things represent. And in the Old Testament, it was Alexander the Great was told to us to be the ram with one horn, a notable horn. And then the Medo-Persian Empire was the ram with 2 horns that was trampled by this one-horned ram. The ram then, the horn breaks off the ram and 4 horns grow in its place. And that is the 4-part division of Alexander's empire that happened after he died. Now, the reason why this is something I can talk about now and find fulfillments for it is because of those parallels between church history again. We have in the book, I've identified parallels for Alexander the Great and for the Medo-Persian Empire, and it's the Franklin Roosevelt and the United Nations, and then it's the fascists in Europe, the Nazis and Mussolini and Hitler primarily would be the two horns, and I'll get into that I guess after this is over, after I read the prophecy. So the key though about this is that Antiochus is mentioned in this prophecy, and by comparison, we can see Vatican II in Antichrist. So that's why it's something notable. All right, I'm going to go through and read it, and then we'll move from there. Okay. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Balthasar, a vision appeared to me. I, Daniel, after what I had seen in the beginning, saw in my vision when I was in the castle of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was over the gate of Ulai. And I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram stood before the water, having 2 high horns, one higher than the other, and growing up. And afterwards I saw a ram pushing with his horns against the west and the south, against the north and against the south. And no beast could withstand him, nor be delivered out of his hand. And he did according to his own will, and became great. And I understood, and behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and he touched not the ground, and the he-goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Okay, so it tells us at the footnotes there, the ram, the empire of the Medo-Persians, the he-goat, the empire of the Greeks and Macedonians. He touched not the ground, he conquered all before him with so much rapidity that he seemed rather to fly than to walk upon the earth. A notable horn, Alexander the Great. And he went up to the ram that had the horns, which I had seen standing before the gate, and he ran towards him in the force of his strength. And when he was come near the ram, he was enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his 2 horns. And the ram could not withstand him, and when he had cast him down on the ground, he stamped upon him, and none could deliver the ram out of his hand. And the he-goat became exceedingly great, and when he was grown, the great horn was broken, and there came up 4 horns under it towards the 4 winds of heaven. And out of the one of the broken, there came forth a little horn, and it became great against the south and against the east and against the strength. And it was magnified even unto the strength of heaven, and it threw down the strength of the stars and trod upon them. Okay, now it tells us the 4 horns. Seleucus, Antigonus, Philip, and Ptolemaeus, the successors of Alexander, who divided his empire among themselves. And this is what's parallel with the death of Franklin Roosevelt and the 4-part division of Germany, but I'll show that in a minute. A little horn, Antiochus Epiphanes. A descendant of Seleucus, he grew against the south and the east by his victories over the kings of Egypt and Armenia, and against the strength that is against Jerusalem and the people of God. Unto the strength of heaven, or against the strength of heaven, so are here called the army of the Jews, the people of God. Okay. And it was magnified even to the prince of the strength, and it took away from him the continual sacrifice, and it cast down the place of his sanctuary, and strength was given him against the continual sacrifice because of sins, and truth shall be cast on the ground, and he shall do, and he shall prosper. And, that's it. Okay, that's good enough, right? There's the prophecy of the ram. So, through the parallels, we have Franklin Roosevelt. He comes across the Atlantic without touching the ground, the Allied nations, just as the ram did. And with very great speed, the Allies conquered the 2-horned fascist empire of Europe at the time. Mussolini was the smaller one, and Hitler was the larger one. Trampled him to the ground, and then after Franklin Roosevelt died very suddenly, just like Alexander the Great did. They both, by the way, reigned for 12 years. They both died suddenly, and after their deaths, they both had their empires divided up into 4 parts. So in the Old Testament, we have the Seleucids. A little horn grows from that 4-part division. That little horn is Antiochus. In church history, from the communist division, from the communist part of division of Europe, we have the infiltration of the Vatican by the communists. And that's what I've showed in prior videos, and you probably already are familiar with this. Bella Dodd testified about the infiltration of communism into the Catholic Church in the 40s and the 50s. She testified, I believe, maybe in the 30s. I can't remember. Anyway, and then you also have Paul VI and John the 23rd. Both were communist sympathizers. John Paul II might have even been a communist agent. But the point here is that the little horn, which is Antichrist, grows out of the communist section of the divisions, right? So it's communism that infiltrates the Vatican. And that's you can see that here because Antiochus, who is the prefigurement of the Antichrist, he comes from the Seleucid Empire. And then I can show I can't do it in this video, but there's tons of parallels between the Seleucids and the communists. I guess we can get into those later. And then we know, of course, Antiochus takes away the sacrifice, and Vatican II is when we have our sacrifice taken away. I think it's notable also to point out that he grew against, where does it say here? He grew against the prince. I read it somewhere. Well, I'll have to find it. I'll put it on the screen. But the prince in the Old Testament would be the high priest or maybe the leader of Jerusalem. But in church history, clearly the prince would have to be the Pope. And to say that he grew, I wish I could find it and read it. But anyway, I'll put it on the screen. But there's pretty notable things happening there. Okay, second thing I want to point out here is that there's another, this is pretty interesting as well. There's another prophecy in the book of Daniel 11 it's a very long chapter, and it's very difficult to read because it's written in language that confuses people. I mean, it confused me, right? But with the parallels in place, it becomes easy. Like all of the footnotes tell us that the whole chapter is about the war between two of those four parts of the division of Alexander's empire, mainly the Ptolemaic and the Seleucids. So with that in place, we can draw the parallels between the Cold War, which is what happened immediately after the four-part division of Germany in our time. Now, this particular prophecy, I'm just going to read a very small segment of it, because what happens is Antiochus, who's the prefigurement of the Antichrist, he goes over to Egypt, and he's trying to, he brings his ships into Egypt, and he wants to take over Egypt. Now, Egypt, though, is part of the Ptolemaic kingdom. It's under the protectorate of Rome. So Rome's kind of claiming it as its own kind of like protectorate area where it's not directly in charge of, but it says it protects it, which hence the word protectorate. So Antiochus goes over there, and a Roman general named Pompilius, he draws a circle in the ground around Antiochus, and he gives him an ultimatum, and I'll get into that in a minute. So Antiochus is humiliated. He has to withdraw, and he goes back to Jerusalem, and then he puts the abomination on the altar and desecrates the temple. So here's the relevant portion of the prophecy of Daniel 11, which references that. And then I'm going to read an account by the Roman historian Livy, which gives the actual Roman history of what happened as well. And then I'll draw the parallel in church history. Okay. At the time appointed, he shall return, and he shall come to the south, but the latter time shall not be like the former. And the galleys and the Romans shall come upon him, and he shall be struck, and shall return, and he shall have indignation against the covenant of the sanctuary, and he shall succeed, and he shall return and shall devise against them that have forsaken the covenant of the sanctuary. The galleys of the Romans, Pompilius and the other Roman ambassadors who came in galleys and obliged him to depart from Egypt. Okay, and here's the last verse. In arms shall stand on his part, and they shall defile the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the continual sacrifice, and they shall place there the abomination unto desolation. So that's all in the books of the Maccabees. This is Daniel prophesizing about that. Now, here's Livy's account. I'm going to read about Livy describing what happened from the Roman point of view. Let's see here if I can just kind of get past all this stuff we don't need because we're running low on time. I guess I'll start from the beginning. After receiving the submission of the inhabitants of Memphis and of the rest of the Egyptian people, who submitted voluntarily, others under threats, Antiochus marched by easy stages towards Alexandria, which is a city in Egypt. After crossing the river Elysius, about 4 miles from Alexandria, he was met by the Roman commissions, to whom he gave a friendly greeting and held out his hand to Pompilius. Pompilius, however, placed in his hand the tablets in which was written the decree of the Senate and told him first to read it. After reading it through, he said he would call his friends. Antiochus said he would call his friends into council and consider what he ought to do. Because Rome was telling Pompilius to withdraw, or Pompilius was telling Antiochus to withdraw from Egypt. That's what the tablet said. And so Antiochus said, okay, I'll consider this. Let me go back to my people, and we're going to consider it. And Pompilius said no. He said, stern and imperious as ever, drew a circle around the king with a stick who was carrying, and said, before you step out of the circle, give me a reply to lay before the Senate. For a few moments he hesitated, and Antiochus hesitated, astounded at such a peremptory order, and at last replied, I will do what the Senate thinks right. Not till then did Pompilius extend his hand to the king in friendship. So Antiochus was put on the spot by having a circle drawn around him and given an ultimatum. Don't step out of that circle to tell me if you're going to comply with the Roman Senate's decrees or not. So, like I said, the Ptolemaics, or the ones who had Alexandria in Egypt, and the Seleucids were the ones who were trying to invade. This happened in church history just at the same time that Vatican II was starting. So recall, first of all, from the prophecy of Daniel that I just read, that after he was chased out of Egypt by the Romans, it says that he then went back and put the abomination on the second altar in Jerusalem. So here we have, in church history, you have the same thing happening between the Americans and the Soviets at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's happening just at the time of Vatican II starting. So Khrushchev, he goes and sails his boats, his ships over to Cuba. Now, Cuba's under the protectorate of America. America's protecting, it protects Cuba as its own. It's threatened if the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, so when John F. Kennedy learns about this, he draws two big circles around Cuba, and he calls them quarantine lines. And he gives an ultimatum to Khrushchev. He says, don't cross that line. If you cross that line, we might have war. So Khrushchev is likely, he's like Antiochus, he's put on the spot. And remember, though, that the Soviets and the Seleucids are paralleled, right? So Antiochus is put on the spot, and Khrushchev is put on the spot, and Khrushchev withdraws, just like Antiochus does. And then, amazingly, though, Antiochus goes back and he desecrates the temple, and then he puts on the abomination. And that's exactly what happened immediately after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vatican II is opened, and then we have the same things happen. Our temples begin to be desecrated, and we have the Novus Ordo, which it follows in a couple short years. In 1965, it was decreed. In 1969, it was implemented. So just another correlation between secular events that happened outside of the church and then parallels within the church as well, which would be, like I said, the abomination in the Novus Ordo. Okay, I'm running out of time here. That's just that's one topic in the book. There's many, many, many more. I guess I'll touch upon those in future episodes. All right, have a great day. Glory be to God, and Ave Maria.